Have you ever seen a TV show so epic that it changes the rules of what you thought was possible? Not just a fantasy story, but true mythology at its absolute most intense. That is the TV show that we could have gotten. That is what Tolkien wrote. That is the potential that Rings of Power had way back in the beginning. But honestly, this isn't a video about, the actual Rings of Power show. If you want to know my subjective thoughts on that show so far, in one word, I would describe it as weak. But in this video, I'm going to be talking about a different show, a hypothetical show that could have existed if a good faith interpretation of what Tolkien wrote was the actual engine of adaptation here. And the main thing that I really want to do with this video is debunk the myth that Rings of Power couldn't have been good if it stayed true to the source material. I want to prove that the source material can be adapted in an awesome yet faithful way. You just have to draw the adaptation out of Tolkien's writings instead of projecting it onto them. By following the professor's lead, one of the most epic stories ever told just kind of adapts itself. Maya Govanen Melanin, and welcome to another Tolkien Untangled video on adapting the Second Age, or how the Rings of Power should have been written. In this video, I talked about my ideas for seasons 1 and 2, which would tell the first part of that Second Age trilogy, the story of the elves and their conflict with Sauron. And in this video, I talked about season 3, and how the second part of that trilogy could be introduced and adapted without foolishly compressing the timeline, which fundamentally breaks a huge part of what makes the Second Age so special. And the second part of this Second Age trilogy is the story of the Númenóreans and their conflict with Sauron. So, if you've not seen the previous videos, especially the last one where I talked about a faithful version of Season 3, I definitely would recommend checking them out, as this video will talk about a lot of what I introduced in the last video. However, whereas in Season 3 there was no choice but to invent storylines and conflict simply because Tolkien never elaborated on the first half of the story, the trajectory of Season 4 is right there in the source material. I wasn't being dramatic a moment ago when I said that this story has the potential to be true mythology. The Downfall of Númenor, which is what I think Season 4 of the Rings of Power should be all about, is not a novel. It's not a conventional story with scenes and dialogue and a 3-act structure. What it is instead is mythology. This is a story explaining the most profound and universal aspects of humanity. It's about men rebelling against gods. It's about apocalypse. It's about hope and despair, past and future, corruption and redemption, and at its absolute core, the through line that should cut into the very heart of every theme in every episode. This is a story about death and the desire for deathlessness. Those are Tolkien's words, not mine. However, before I properly begin, there is the question of rights. Like, what parts of Tolkien's writings do the showrunners have permission to use? And this is tricky, because according to the showrunners themselves, all that they have the rights to is The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and its appendices. But for a very long time, I've been kind of skeptical of that claim, and the main piece of evidence that I've used to justify why is that this is one of the first pieces of promotional material that we ever saw, and this map can only be found in the Unfinished Tales. However, it has since been pointed out to me that apparently this map was also once included in some edition of The Lord of the Rings from the 80s. I've tried googling which one, not found anything. Anyway, maybe the showrunners really are telling the truth. Maybe they really do only have the rights to The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. But still, I just can't quite bring myself to believe it. Perhaps I'm still giving the showrunners too much credit, who knows, but I just can't bring myself to believe that anyone could possibly be so foolish as to try and adapt a Second Age story without an overwhelming majority of the source material. Surely, please, that can't possibly be the case. I mean, all the evidence suggests that it is the case, but there is a tiny part of me that's still holding on to a tiny sliver of hope that perhaps when it comes to the fall of Númenor, Tolkien's actual writings could still be adhered to. And my theory, well, it's not really a theory, I have no evidence, my hypothesis is predicated upon the knowledge that on the 10th of November of this year, 26 days after the Season 1 finale, a new Tolkien book is going to be released. It's not new in the sense that it contains any new writings, but basically it will contain everything Tolkien wrote regarding the Second Age, collected and presented in one volume for the first time. Now, this book could not have been edited together without first being signed off on by the Tolkien estate, and we know that Amazon negotiated a whole new thing with the Tolkien estate to acquire whatever rights they actually have. And the timing of a Second Age book coinciding with a Second Age TV show does make me wonder if there's something more going on here than the showrunners are admitting. If it's true that they don't have the rights to the Silmarillion or the Unfinished Tales as they claim, but they do have the partial rights to this new Fall of Númenor book, then they have the rights to everything they need. So, for the purposes of this video, I guess as a courtesy to the showrunners, I will try to stick as closely as possible to what the Rings of Power unambiguously does have the rights to, like The Lord of the Rings and its appendices. And so I'm not going to include loads of stuff from the Silmarillion, but I'm also not going to cripple this story for the sake of refusing to follow Tolkien's lead. However, even in some bizarre universe where a studio would spend $250 million on not acquiring the rights to what they need, honestly, I reckon one could still create the most epic season of TV ever, and that's because of what I said a moment ago. The story of Númenor's downfall, the focus of Season 4, the Akala Beth, as it's called in Adunaic, is so mythological. It is basically Tolkien's retelling of the Atlantis myth. Normally, I would be super reluctant to project any kind of real-world religion onto Tolkien's writings. Tolkien very famously wrote in the Fellowship of the Ring's foreword, "I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations." But in the case of the Downfall of Númenor, Tolkien totally did refer to Elendil as a Noachian figure. And at the end of the day, what we're dealing with here is a flood myth. The themes that Tolkien's exploring aren't locked away in some super specific part of the history of Middle-earth. The flood myth is one of the most ubiquitous and universal stories ever told by humans. The tale of a great civilization being destroyed by an even greater flood, while only a small number of faithful individuals are spared, that is found in the ancient Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh. It's found in the ancient Greek tale of Deucalion. It's found in the ancient Hindu story of Shraddhadeva. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but obviously it's also found in the Judeo-Christian Islamic belief of Noah. Even the legend of Atlantis itself is a story of a flood and a downfall. In fact, that Adunaic word, Akalabeth, which means by its simplest definition, downfallen, is translated into Quenya as Atalante, which isn't quite allegory, but it definitely is an allusion. Atalante alludes to Atlantis. Even Tolkien commented on this by calling it a happy accident. And guys, the truth is this. Tolkien's Middle-earth version of this flood myth, this Atlantis story, the downfall of Númenor, is the coolest thing ever. Now, one day I will make a whole series explaining everything Tolkien ever wrote about the Akala Beth. This is not that. This is instead an overview of how I believe that story could be adapted for TV. How Númenor's ruin could potentially be among the most epic seasons of any show ever. And all you have to do to make that happen is just be a tiny bit creative while fundamentally trusting in Tolkien to take us to the absolute brink of the most awesome thing ever. So, without any further ado, let's begin my proposal for a Tolkien-esque adaptation of The Downfall of Númenor, starting with Season 4, Episode 1. Now, considering how wild things are going to get by the end, I think we should begin this season really small. really intimate, really personal. Kind of like how The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit begin. And as a slight subversion of that central theme, death and the desire for deathlessness, I think Season 4 should begin with new life. We open on a wedding. It's nice, but it's not fancy. There aren't many people, there's no decorations beyond candles, maybe a few flowers, but it is lovely. It's joyful, and it's humble. There is love and laughter and music here. And I think that by seeing how our main characters behave during a time of celebration, we can reintroduce their personalities without wasting too much time on exposition. Because this is a wedding among the faithful. Everyone in attendance belongs to that small group of rebel Númenóreans who still remember the old days, when the men of Númenor were elf friends. When Númenor's first king, Elros, twin brother of Elrond, laid down his life and willingly relinquished his spirit to Ilúvatar, for he knew that death was a gift for men. And the first of the faithful that we should linger on is their lord, their leader, a direct descendant of that first king, Elros, but through the non-ruling elder line of his great-great-granddaughter, Silmarillane. We see her heirlooms in this lord's possession, the silver sceptre of Andúnie, the elf-forged ring of Barahir, and the first-age sword, Narsil. And, of course, the lord who rightfully owns all three of these heirlooms of Silmarillane is the rightful lord of Andúnie, Elendil. Last time we saw Elendil, back in the Season 3 finale, he was among the victorious Númenóreans, returning home from Middle-earth after Sauron's surrender to the King Ar-Pharazôn the Golden. And, for reasons I'll explain in a little bit, I think Season 4 should begin about 2 years after Season 3 ended. The note we left Elendil on was kind of a grim certainty that things in Númenor were about to get an awful lot worse. And now they have. But not today. Today, Elendil's hardships are put aside for the sake of a wedding among his people, his family. Also, I think Season 4 can expand upon a character that I didn't mention much in Season 3, but she definitely should be present in the story, and that is Elendil's wife, the mother of Isildur and Anarion. Just like her daughters-in-law, Elendil's wife is never named or even mentioned by Tolkien, and yet we know she must have existed. One day she will become the first queen of Arnor. She will be a direct ancestor of Aragorn and a matriarch of both lines of Dúnedain kings, Gondor and Arnor. So I think she is a character worth embellishing. And for the sake of, showcasing diversity, really, I would imagine Elendil's wife hailing from a part of Númenor that we've not yet explored. Númenor is huge, and there's a lot more to it than just the cities of Armenelos and Rómenna, so I think we should get to see some of that variety in this character. We know that she will eventually become queen of the northern kingdom of Arnor, so let's say she hails from the northernmost part of Númenor, the mountainous region of Forostar. And we know that back in the day, Forostar was the abode of great eagles. So if I had to make up a name for this character, I would suggest something like Soroniel. Sauron is a Quenya rendering of Thoron, which means eagle, and in this context, El just makes it feminine. Anyway, our next major character to reintroduce is Soroniel and Elendil's second son, Anarion, the son of the sun. By Númenórean standards, Anarion is still pretty young, he's only 38, and as a second son, without the pressure put upon his elder brother, I imagine Anarion being a slightly more carefree character, who's charismatic and loves to laugh and have a good time. So Anarion is enjoying this wedding very much. And for the same reason that I mentioned Anarion's mother, Soroniel, we know that before the end of this season, Anarion will also have taken a wife. In fact, Tolkien tells us that the firstborn child of Anarion's is the last person ever to be born on the island of Númenor. Now, I don't think we need to focus too much on this in Season 4, this is not a romance story, but maybe in this first scene we can witness Anarion developing a friendship with some lady among the faithful, and over the course of the series they'll develop a loving relationship, and eventually, before the finale, they will have a baby. Anyway, finally, we should reintroduce the two main characters who are actually getting married in this scene, Isildur and Eärien. I know in the show, Eärien is Isildur's sister. For reasons I've already explained, that is a terrible decision. It breaks Tolkien's law. They could have done anything with Eärdien's character except making her the sister of Isildur and Anarion. So in this version, I've decided to make her Isildur's betrothed, and now, after this scene, his wife. She will be the mother of the heirs of Isildur. Anyway, what Eärien means is daughter of water, and what Isildur means is servant of the moon. And at the beginning of Season 4, these two lives officially become one. In Season 3, Eärdien's character arc was basically that of a naive Númenorian woman spending 5 years becoming ennobled by her friendship with Elrond, and her time in Rivendell, and her meeting with dwarves in Khazad-dûm, and the elves of the Golden Wood, and even Entwives on her way down the River Anduin. So basically, the Eärien of Season 4 is a pretty unique Númenorian. She has a perspective that no one else has. She is a personal friend to the twin brother of Númenor's first ever king. Now, this wedding is not in and of itself a particularly important event, but there aren't going to be a huge number of happy moments in Season 4, and I think that the really heavy stuff that we're going to get to later will have even more of an impact if we establish that there is still at least some joy left in Númenor among the faithful. Also, family is a central theme in exploring why these characters matter in the big picture, and by Season 5, every one of them will be Dúnedain royalty. All of Gondor and Arnor will look to Elendil, Soroniel, Isildur, Eärien, Anarion, and whoever his wife is. However, as this opening scene comes to an end and Isildur and Eärien embrace happily as husband and wife, we should see Elendil's smile fade. He knows that any happiness his people and his children may currently be enjoying cannot last past tomorrow. This wedding night exists in stark contrast to the Númenorian norm, and when morning comes, the faithful will once again face dire times. Then the camera pans out, and we see just how small and humble Elendil's community of faithful really is within the massive port city of Rómenna, the city in the east where the faithful were forcibly relocated to and now live under the boot heel of the hateful majority, the King's Men. And as the camera sweeps west, we move inland and pass over about 50 miles of Númenorian country. But this is a very different island to what we saw in the prologue of Season 3. Forests have been razed to build warships. What once was green has now turned brown. Nature itself is angry. In Season 4, Númenor should be a character in its own right, and the arc of this character over the span of this season should be a really tragic one. Over these 8 or 10 episodes, or however many we have, we are going to watch an unbelievably glorious, powerful nation die. Finally, the camera pans over to Armenelos, the capital. And as we zoom back in, we see that it is a bustling metropolis, but without even a single shred of elvish architecture. Armenelos is not only the literal capital of the King's Men, it is the metaphorical heart of all the corruption and rot that has spread through Númenor. We should see vast statues of the king cast in gold. And I think there's an interesting theme that can be explored here with gold. In the last video, I talked about how in Tolkien's writings, there is some very mysterious power in water, and that power is fundamentally good. However, gold is the absolute opposite. Just as there is goodness in water, there is corruption in gold. In fact, Tolkien actually explicitly stated that. He wrote that Morgoth's power was disseminated throughout gold, and he even referred to the metal as the Morgoth element in matter. Later, he even clarified that all gold in Middle-earth seems to have a specially evil trend. And we see this in quite a few instances. The One Ring is of course made of gold, Smaug is drawn to gold, and what the name Pharazôn means is golden. Interestingly, the precious metal of the good guys is typically silver. Anyway, in the very heart of Armenelos the Golden is the Palace of the King. In the centre of the palace is the golden throne, and upon the golden throne sits the golden king, Ar-Pharazôn. But Ar-Pharazôn and the King's Men represent the absolute antithesis of Elendil and the Faithful. In the 2 years since Season 3, times have turned harder for the Faithful, yet they can still find joy. Pharazôn, on the other hand, is surrounded by opulence and splendour, yet he is utterly without joy. And speaking of Pharazôn's utter lack of joy, we should also catch up with his loveless wife, /cousin, the actual rightful queen, Míriel, who is now going by her Adonaic name, Zimrafel, that's been forced upon her by Pharazôn. And Míriel is not the easiest character to adapt because Tolkien told us so little about her. But as I'm putting this video together and thinking about how she could be written in a way that kind of explores and enhances the most Tolkien-esque of themes, I think she actually has the potential to be one of the most interesting characters in the entire Númenor storyline. A good faith interpretation of what Tolkien actually wrote about her leads us to a truly fascinating figure. So, Míriel is the firstborn child of the firstborn child of all Númenor's kings, going back to the brother of Silmarien, the ancestor of Elendil. So, Míriel is a big deal. She is the rightful owner of the ruling sceptre. She is Númenor's rightful queen. And yet, at the beginning of Season 4, she's basically powerless. Míriel is a character who has always embodied contradictions, and now in Season 4 we see that dialed up to 11. She is a prisoner in her own palace, and yet she is the ruling queen of Númenor. She absolutely despises Pharazôn for seizing her sceptre, and yet he is her husband/cousin. She is the lady of the King's Men, yet she is a friend to the Faithful. And in one specific way, Míriel is kinda unique. On the one hand, it can be argued that she is the most powerless person in Númenor, and yet she has total power over the most powerful person in Númenor. The only reason that she is Pharazôn's wife is because he forced her to marry him, but he cannot force her to bear him a child. That's not how procreation works in Tolkien's writings. An unwilling union cannot create life. However, divorce is also not a thing in Tolkien's writings, so Pharazôn is now stuck with Míriel. She is the closest thing he has to any shred of legitimacy. He needs her to secure a legacy, and without her consent he will never have an heir. The line of Pharazôn will die with him. It's up to Míriel to ensure it, because she hates him. Her rightful power has been seized from her, yet Míriel is able to seize her own kind of power. She is a prisoner, yet simultaneously she is untouchable. Navigating contradictions is what Míriel's whole character should be about. Anyway, in the first episode, Elendil should come to Armenelos. His family, the Lords of Arnduinne, have historically always been advisors to the king. Elendil's father Amandil was the chief advisor to Míriel's father Tar-Palantir, and back in Season 3, Elendil spent all his time in Armenelos. But things are different now. The childhood friendship he once shared with Pharazôn has now turned to dust. The only reason he's even come to the capital is to answer to the summons of the king. And the reason Pharazôn has summoned Elendil to Armenelos is to make him answer for his perceived betrayal. At the end of Season 3, Eärien was reunited with Elendil's family and the Faithful, but she was also reunited with the Kingsmen. Every soldier of Númenor witnessed the return of the elf friend, and in the 2 years that have passed, Eärien has basically become a figurehead of everything the Kingsmen despise. She is public enemy number 1. And instead of banishing her from Númenor as Pharazôn demanded, Elendil has not only taken her under his protection, now he has allowed her to marry his son Isildur. And for Pharazôn, this is an act of treachery. He demands that Elendil exile Eärien and Isildur too, if he must, or else there shall be bloodshed in Númenor. However, in the absence of the actual queen, Elendil states that the ruling sceptre holds no authority in Pharazôn's hand. He refuses to recognize Pharazôn's sovereignty and he demands that Tar Míriel be present to pass judgment in her husband's stead. And to this, I think Pharazôn can answer something along the lines of, "He told me you would say that." No indication yet on who he is, although I'm sure you guys can guess. Anyway, the conversation turns more and more ugly, and it basically ends with Pharazôn telling Elendil that if Eärien remains in Númenor, it shall lead to war, and all the faithful shall be destroyed. That is Elendil's choice, his family or his people. Elendil leaves the throne room in disgrace, but before he leaves the city, he is approached by a handmaiden of Míriel's. She leads him to a now deserted place where the white tree of Númenor, Nimloth, stands almost bare. There is only one fruit left upon its branches, and beneath those branches waits Míriel, with an ornate wooden box in her hands. Elendil and Míriel should have a conversation, and I think the point of this conversation should really just be an exploration of how complex their relationship has now become. They are friends, they always have been, but now they are trapped in opposite worlds. I imagine there is a part of Míriel that would consider leaving Armenelos and joining Elendil's faithful, but she can't do that. She may not be the de facto ruler, but she is the rightful queen. And to abandon her capital would be to officially yield that right. Also, this is another example of Míriel's contradictions. She views herself as the ruler of all Númenorians, both kingsmen and faithful. And so, whereas Pharazôn and Elendil's wants and needs are very much conceptual and philosophical, Míriel's are much more pragmatic. She wants to preserve peace at all costs. She is the daughter of an elf friend, the granddaughter of an elf hater, a descendant of all kings and queens, both good and bad, and at the core of her character, she wants to bring her people back together. She knows that if she fails, it will mean the end of everything, the doom of Númenor. Anyway, when the conversation ends, Elendil should take his leave, he should acknowledge Míriel as his true queen, and she should gift him the box that she is carrying. Inside, Elendil finds a palantir. I'll come back to that. But staying in Armenelos for just a moment longer, there's another part of Tolkien's writings that I would like to expand upon here. No names are ever given, but Tolkien did make multiple references to a group of Númenorians known as the Council of the Sceptre, basically the king's advisors. Once upon a time, Elendil and his father Amandil and all the lords of Andúnië were the chief councillors of the king. But in these dark days of Season 4, the Council of the Sceptre is pretty much just made up of Pharazôn's cronies. However, for the sake of really honing in on Tolkien's themes, there is one member in particular who I think can be used to explore something quite interesting. I imagine this guy would have featured as a supporting character in Season 3, but his main role in the story is that he's basically Pharazôn's mentor. He's an older Númenorian who was once a friend of Pharazôn's father, the brother of Míriel's father, Tar Palantir. This mentor is made up, so his name could be anything, so long as it's Adonaic, but for the sake of this video, I'll call him Gimilzagar, a name Tolkien invented. Anyway, the reason that I think Gimilzagar should feature in this story is to further explore that central theme of death and the desire for deathlessness. Pharazôn is no longer a young man, and so his mentor, a friend of his father's, would now be very old indeed. And I imagine Gimilzagar's big scene basically representing a kind of dark mirror of that cold opening scene which began both seasons 1 and 3. In that scene, we saw old man Elros on his deathbed. But in that instance, Elros was not sick or weak, and he was not killed by old age. He simply relinquished his life in acknowledgement that death is a gift from Ilúvatar. However, this Gimilzagar guy living 3,000 years later should be the absolute opposite. He is old and sick and weak, but he is clinging to life in desperation, so utterly afraid of dying. I actually imagine this being a pretty unpleasant scene to watch, but it's important for Pharazôn's character. Despite all his pride and his arrogance, Pharazôn is powerless to prevent the death of his counselor, his mentor, his friend. Old, bitter, hateful Gimilzagar lies on his deathbed, holding Pharazôn's hand, forcing himself to stay awake, keeping his red eyes open, delaying the end for as long as he can, enduring the agony of dying, because he believes it to be better than death. But in the end, whether embraced willingly or forced upon us, death must eventually come. Such is the nature of mortal men. And so, Gimilzagar dies, and Pharazôn is left holding his lifeless hand. And it becomes painfully clear to Pharazôn that this horrible fate is what awaits him too. His father died young. He is no longer young, and time is running out. Every day, death draws nearer, and what originally began as Pharazôn's desire for deathlessness has now contorted into a cripplingly obsessive fear of death. Which brings us to Season 4's final main character. After night falls, Pharazôn raises a hood over his head, and he descends in secret into the bowels of his dungeons. And there he finds his prisoner, waiting for him, happy to see him. And it finally becomes clear who Pharazôn was referring to when he said to Elendil, "He told me you would say that." Pharazôn has spent the past 2 years taking secret counsel with Sauron. In fact, when all else is stripped away, what Season 4 is fundamentally about is Sauron's transition from Pharazôn's prisoner to his servant, to his counselor, to his puppet master, to the source of his utter ruin. This is why I think Season 4 should begin 2 years after Season 3. Tolkien tells us that before 3 years had passed, Sauron had become closest to the secret counsels of the king. And in this scene, we need to see why. Pharazôn comes to Sauron with death on his mind. But Season 4 Sauron is unlike any previous incarnation we've yet seen. He's humble. He's a prisoner, far removed from the awe-inspiringly angelic Anatar of Season 1, but he's also wise and thoughtful and articulate, much more so than the warrior Sauron, Lord of the Earth, that we met in Season 2. And unlike the Lord of Mordor and the King of Men that we met in Season 3, this version of Sauron is, in Tolkien's words, sweet as honey. He's charming, consoling, almost kind. He flatters Pharazôn from his dungeon cell, and without having to be told about the death of Gimilzagar, he offers comfort to the king in his time of grief. every word that falls from Pharazôn's mouth is twisted by Sauron back towards the hatred that lies at the very core of Pharazôn's psyche. He hates the faithful. He hates the elves. He hates the ban of the Valar. He hates that Númenóreans cannot sail into the uttermost west. He hates Sauron even to an extent, but deeper than all of that, at the very heart of who he is, Pharazôn hates that he is not deathless. The very thing that Elros embraced so peacefully and healthily back in the beginning is now Pharazôn's ultimate fear. To be free of it is his ultimate desire, yet that is such a violation of nature. Mortals have to die. It is their gift. But there is an exception. Or rather, there are 9 exceptions. 9 mortal men who at this time, it would appear, have escaped the gift of death. And they have done so by accepting another gift. Gifts from Sauron. So, Sauron begins to tell Pharazôn exactly what he wants to hear. There is a way for mortals to become deathless. Sauron has already given that gift to the Nazgûl. He's proven that it's possible. And despite all of Pharazôn's pride and his hubris and his disdain for Sauron, this truth cannot be forced from his mind. All men must die unless they embrace the will of Sauron. And so Pharazôn comes to Sauron more, and he becomes more and more dependent until, finally, the time is right for Sauron to make his winning move. To tell the lie that will, eventually, drown the island of Númenor. There is no such thing as Ilúvatar. He is an invention of the Valar, only a deception, a phantom devised to enchain men in servitude. Elros believed in Ilúvatar because he was deceived by the wicked gods of the West. He was manipulated into the foolish belief that death could be a gift. Like all Númenóreans, he was cursed by the Valar, inflicted with the punishment that is mortality. And it's all because the Valar are jealous. They envy the power of the Númenóreans. They fear what these men could become. And so in their cruelty, they withhold the right of deathlessness. But there is one who could set them free. The true All-Father, the giver of freedom, the one who could make Númenóreans mightier than even the Valar. Melkor, whom the elves call Morgoth. But to worship Melkor, the Númenóreans would surely need a high priest, someone to show them the way. Ideally one who followed Melkor back in the beginning, perhaps even his protege, his disciple, his successor. And so, within the first few episodes of Season 4, Sauron's lies deliver him from being Pharazôn's slave to his right-hand man, the high priest of Númenor's new religion, Melkor worship. Eventually, Pharazôn summons what remains of the Council of the Sceptre, and he announces that today marks the dawn of a golden age. This is the beginning of a new Númenor, where even death shall be overcome. And as the councillors look to each other in confusion, Pharazôn introduces his new chief councillor, their new boss, the guy who will make Númenor greater than it has ever been before, Sigurd, the Wise One, the Wizard. Actually, we probably wouldn't have the rights to use that name Zigur, but it doesn't matter. The specific word isn't what's important, what matters is the language. Sauron has to take a new name now that he's in Númenor, and there are two reasons why. First, Sauron is an Elvish Quenya name, and these Númenorians do not like Quenya. Second, Sauron is a Quenya name meaning the abhorred, and Sauron is abhorred in Númenor no longer. So, although we may not be able to use the name that Tolkien specifically gave us, Zigur, we do have to use some Adunaic name, otherwise it won't make sense. Anyway, I imagine as Zigur appears before the council, looking very, very different to the humble prisoner we saw a few episodes ago, one or two of the less radical Kingsmen might raise the very reasonable question, how can Melkor be Númenor's saviour when the whole point of Númenorians is that they are descendants of the men, the Edain, who fought against Melkor in the First Age? However, any and all dissent within the council would be very swiftly expunged. The most self-serving of the king's men would no doubt see that Zigur is who the king now looks to, and thus they follow Sauron as a way of maintaining their power. And the very few who do resist at first cannot do so for long. The reason for that is the One Ring. Now, originally, I made a whole point about this in the last video, but then I had to cut it for time because it was super long. Anyway, the question of whether Sauron does or does not have the One Ring with him in Númenor is tricky. On the one hand, we are told in the Silmarillion that after Númenor's downfall, Sauron took up again the Great Ring, which implies he left it in Barad-dûr before surrendering to Pharazôn. And to be fair, this probably would be a really cool scene. Right at the end of Season 3, we could have seen Sauron remove the ruling ring from his finger, he could have set it down for safety in Barad-dûr, and it would kind of be like an insurance. You know, it's the first step in his master plan. So long as the ring is in Mordor, he can't lose in the long run. However, that line in the Silmarillion is only an implication. It doesn't state that Sauron left his ring in Mordor, and in Letter 211, Tolkien does state that he didn't. Tolkien wrote that after arriving in Númenor, Sauron naturally had the One Ring, and so very soon dominated the minds and wills of most Númenorians. Now, you may be thinking, well, why didn't Pharazôn confiscate the One Ring? But Tolkien wrote in that exact same letter, I do not think Ar-Pharazôn knew anything about the One Ring. The elves kept the matter of the rings very secret. In any case, Ar-Pharazôn was not in communication with them. And as to why Pharazôn can't just, literally see the ring on Sauron's finger, in The Lord of the Rings, we are told that when Sam looks upon Galadriel's finger, he sees only a light, but no ring. So there totally is a Tolkienian precedent for powerful beings with rings of power to wear those rings in the unseen world, which cannot be perceived by mortals. So, for the sake of following what we can be pretty sure Tolkien intended, at least certainly at one point in his life, in this version, Sauron has the One Ring with him in secret in Númenor. Anyway, before the halfway point of Season 4, Ar-Pharazôn, the Council of the Sceptre, and all the King's Men of Númenor now look to Sauron, their wizard, their saviour, their priest. So that's what's happening in Armenelos. But before we can get to the absolute madness that is the second half of Season 4, we first need to catch up on what's going on in Rómenna with the Faithful. And Tolkien doesn't give us a huge amount to go off here, but there is enough for us to draw out a storyline that both moves the plot forward and also explores themes that pertain to Númenor. Rómenna is a vast port city that belongs to the King's Men. And it was from here that both Pharazôn and the Númenorian king, from way back in Season 2, launched their fleet of ships to do war in Middle-earth. However, Rómenna is also the home to the Faithful. Not by choice, the western city of Arnduinne is their ancestral home, but now they live in a closed-off community within the city of their enemy. And we are told in the Silmarillion that the King's Men frequently seized and abused the Faithful of Rómenna, And Tolkien states explicitly that this was never openly on the charge that they would not worship Melkor, rather was cause sought against them that they hated the king and were his rebels, or that they plotted against their king, devising lies and poisons. These charges were for the most part false, yet those were bitter days, and hate brings forth hate. And this language calls to my mind a kind of witch hunt in Númenor, where guilt is presumed and accusations require no evidence. We don't need those specific Silmarillion words to imagine the faithful at this time living under constant threat of seizure and arrest at the whims of their tyrant overlords. Also, something else that I think should be featured in any adaptation of Númenor is the relationship that exists between Númenorians and their horses. We are told that back in the beginning, all the people of the land loved horses, treating them honourably and housing them nobly. Back in Season 1, I think there should have been a scene between Gil-galad and that Númenorian prince, who I called Halbrand back then. I have now seen the show, and I've learned that Halbrand is not actually a Númenorian character, so I would retroactively rename that Season 1 character to Aladarion, considering that's the character I actually based him off. Anyway, this Númenorian prince should have demonstrated to the elves of Season 1 that his people have a wonderfully symbiotic relationship with their horses. They even ride them in the elvish style, without the use of saddles or harness or reins or anything. Númenorians built their roads and their infrastructure around their love of horses. But that was then. Now the king's men have rebelled so hard against nature and moved so far away from the elvish style of doing things that their horses are no longer their friends. They are beasts of burden. They are driven forward by whips and by spurs, and their mistreatment at the rods of their masters is just one more example of how far most Númenorians have now fallen. Anyway, the reason that I mention this is because I'm imagining a scene where a group of the king's men in Rómenna, bullies basically, ride into the impoverished and crowded community of faithful Númenorians looking for trouble, looking for any kind of excuse that could be used as charges to justify their abuse. But as the captain of these king's men rides through narrow streets and his spurs draw blood from his steed and he smacks its neck with his whip, the horse suddenly rears up and it throws him off. It starts to panic, it starts to freak out, it's blocking the road, it's letting fly with its heels, its rider lies on the street with a broken arm. But then, out of the crowd of the faithful emerges Eärien, the most elven of all Númenorians. She places a hand on the anxious horse, and she speaks to it in the elven tongue. Immediately the horse becomes calm. It nuzzles Eärien, and it allows her to stroke it. But the kingsman with the broken arm and the rest of his cronies instantly accuse Eärien of bewitching his beast, of using evil elvish sorcery to attack them. The king's men move to seize Eärien, but as they do, her husband Isildur steps between them. My favourite Númenorian character. The kingsman draws his sword and Isildur's brother Anarion draws his. The rest of the king's men arm themselves, the rest of the faithful arm themselves, battle is about to break out, but then Elendil appears. He raises his hand, he shows the ring of Barahir, and the faithful back down. Elendil approaches the outnumbered group of king's men, and he addresses the captain with the broken arm. He tells him to return to his king, to tell Pharazôn that his life was spared by the mercy of the faithful. The king's men depart, and the faithful linger in the foreboding that they've just inched one step closer to civil war. That evening, I think we should get a scene with Elendil and his family, Soroniel, Isildur, Eärien, Anarion, as well as potentially a few other members of the faithful. And we should explore that choice that Pharazôn gave him, his family or his people. Perhaps someone could suggest leaving Númenor and taking the faithful into exile in Middle-earth. At least that way they would be safe from the kingsmen. But neither Elendil nor Isildur would agree. Númenor is the land of the gift. It was raised out of the ocean by the Valar themselves. It is the legacy of Elendil, the kingdom of Elros. To leave it now would be to yield that gift to Sauron. It would be an insult to the Edain of the First Age who gave their lives in the fight against Morgoth. I guess what this scene should fundamentally be exploring is the Tolkienian theme of hope and despair. On the one hand, it may seem that there is no hope. Númenor is doomed and there is nothing left for the faithful to stay for. But that is not how Isildur or Elendil would see it. In Tolkien's writings, there are two kinds of hope, Armadir and Estel. Armadir is basically optimism. What it literally means is looking up. But Armadir is the less profound type of hope. Armadir is the kind of hope that you'd find in a statement like, I hope it doesn't rain tomorrow. I hope I win the lottery. There's no real reason to believe that that will be the case. It's just optimism. Estel, on the other hand, is a much deeper kind of hope. Estel is probably closer to faith or trust. It is hope that is grounded in something. The faithful do not choose to stay in Númenor out of pride or wishful optimism. They stay because they have Estel. The future is shrouded in darkness, and maybe one day all of Númenor will fall into ruin. But in this moment there is true hope. Even if they're only delaying the long defeat, still there is Estel. There is hope among the faithful that some part of what made Númenor so wonderful could still be saved. Good could still come from this corruption. The lands of Númenor may die, but the idea may not. Come what may, the faithful will not surrender the kingdom of Elros to Sauron. They will not do what Pharazôn wants them to do. In victory or defeat, the faithful will resist. Now, what's written in the Silmarillion implies that Númenor doesn't quite fall into full-blown civil war. It'd probably be more accurate to describe this as a prolonged period of intense civil strife. But in Appendix B of The Lord of the Rings, which is what we actually do have the rights to, Tolkien does straight up use the phrase civil war in Númenor. So, I think the next episode should be all about consequences. After the captain with the broken arm returns to his king and Pharazôn learns that the faithful are now more or less in open rebellion against him, also due to Sauron's influence, he decides to take a force of soldiers to Rómenna and confront Elendil for the final time. However, as his troop of soldiers are preparing to leave Armenelos, Míriel should insist upon accompanying them. I imagine that the Kingsmen's fear of death would also make them very reluctant to risk their lives in combat, and I think Míriel can manipulate this fear by stating that she alone can expel the faithful without any blood of the Kingsmen needing to be spilled. But then I think Sauron should propose his counter-suggestion. Burn them all. Destroy every one of the faithful no matter the cost. Basically, what would Melkor do? He should tell Pharazôn to wipe out all who oppose him, cut down the White Tree Nimloth, erase their law, and demolish all legacies of elf friends, the Valar, and most important of all, Elendil, the guy who brought an end to the rule of Melkor way back in the First Age. But to all this, Pharazôn says no. He's well under Sauron's sway, but he has not yet utterly abandoned reason for madness. Tolkien tells us that at first, Pharazôn would not assent, since he believed that the fortunes of his house were bound up with the tree. And although Pharazôn is the worst, at this point in the story he still has further to fall. After all, Pharazôn is Míriel's cousin. His father was her father's brother, which means that both Míriel and Pharazôn share the same grandfather, Ar-Gimilazor, the king. And so, Pharazôn is a direct descendant of Númenor's kings going all the way back to Elros. And the father of Elros was Eärendil. So, although we'll see in just a little bit how Pharazôn represents in every conceivable sense of the words the anti-Eärendil, he is also his direct descendant. And so, for the moment, his sentiments of Númenorian supremacy outweighs any sincere belief that Melkor worship could set him free. So, Pharazôn takes Míriel along and he leaves Sauron in Armenelos. His force of kingsmen march into Rómenna, into the territory of the Faithful, and the Faithful take up defensive positions in buildings and on rooftops. Arrows aimed at Pharazôn. The kingsmen have the numbers, the Faithful have the high ground, I guess. And so only one thing is certain: if it comes to violence, a lot of people are gonna die. Pharazôn and Míriel should ride forward, and Elendil should come out alone to meet them. Pharazôn repeats the demand he made earlier, an answer to his ultimatum. Will Elendil give up Eärien, or will he let the Faithful die in her place? Will he choose his family or his people? But I do not believe the Elendil that Tolkien wrote would even feel compelled to give an answer. This is the guy who is destined to become the first High King of all the Dúnedain in exile. Upon his finger is the Ring of Barahir. At his side lies Narsil. The silver sceptre of Andúnié is his by right. For Elendil, his people are his family, and his family are his people. He does not love Eärien because she's married to Isildur, or because she's going to be the mother of his future grandchildren. He loves her because she is of the Faithful. And he is the Lord of the Faithful. He is a scion of Silmarien, a descendant of Elros, and a worthy heir to Eärendil. He will not surrender even one of his people to Pharazôn, a usurper, a disgrace to the glory that once was Númenor. But, I can't imagine Pharazôn would take that very well, and because I also can't imagine Elendil being the one to throw the first punch, let's say Pharazôn draws his golden sword and makes ready to slay Elendil right there in the street. But then, he is struck by an arrow, fired from a rooftop. Now, there are any number of potential candidates for who may have loosed this arrow, but after much consideration, I actually think that it would make the most sense for Elendil to be saved by Soroniel, or whatever name we end up giving to his wife. In a battlefield situation, I imagine it would be very bad form for an archer to shoot an enemy, especially the king, without being given the order by his commander. And Soroniel is the only character with the authority to make that decision without stepping on Elendil's toes. She is the Lady of the Faithful. When Elendil is indisposed, it is to her that his people turn. And if it were anyone else who shot Pharazôn, Isildur, or Anarion, for example, I worry that it might come across as impulsive, or reckless, or lacking discipline, which is not how I think these characters should be written. But if Soroniel takes the shot, I think it would seem much more like a considered executive decision, made by the only person of equal authority to Elendil. Anyway, let's say Soroniel shoots Pharazôn, but not to kill. Her arrow hits him in the shoulder, and as he falls from his horse, Míriel leaps down and takes up his sceptre. Her sceptre, actually. As the king's men raise their weapons and Elendil draws Narsil, Míriel steps between them. She raises the sceptre of the king and orders the king's men and the Faithful to stand down. By invoking her Adunaic name, Azimrafel, she passes judgment on Elendil and his people. She orders that the Faithful be banished from Rómenna on pain of death. They are to depart west immediately to Arndunie, to the complete opposite side of the island, and to remove their pro-elven blasphemy from the lands of the King's Men forever. Elendil bows his head and sheaths Narsil. The King's Men, who have no desire to risk their lives fighting the faithful, are appeased that the Queen has taken their side over the rebels, and civil war is, for the moment, postponed. But Míriel's decision here, or Zimrafel's decision, depending on which lens her character is being examined through, is another opportunity to explore her contradictions. On the one hand, she is siding with the King's Men, but on the other, she is saving the faithful from extinction. She is banishing them from their new home by returning them to their ancestral home. She is reversing the decree of her grandfather by sending the faithful away from Rómenna. She is trying to bring Númenor back together by separating the rival Númenorians. And so, by about the halfway point of Season 4, the faithful depart from Rómenna and take all their belongings on the roughly 300-mile-long journey all the way to Arndunie, the ancient city of Silmarien, a place that once was great with elvish-inspired architecture, but now it is dead, long abandoned and left to crumble from the cliffs into the ocean. But this is not a disaster for the faithful. In fact, in some ways, it's a triumph. Thanks to Míriel, the faithful are coming home. Elendil is returning to his seat of power, and although Arndunie is pretty much just rubble by now, because the faithful have survived, the city has love and laughter and music again. The faithful protect the ruin, and the ruin protects the faithful. Which brings us to Season 4's one and only time jump. So, how much time is jumped over? Well, if we're following Tolkien to the absolute letter, it is quite a lot. As I mentioned at the beginning, the first half of Season 4 should begin just a bit over 2 years after Season 3 ends, because Tolkien tells us that ere 3 years had passed, Sauron had become closest to the secret councils of the king. However, the actual downfall of Númenor, which is what all of Seasons 3 and 4 have been working towards, that takes place in the year 3319, which is over 50 years after the end of Season 3. And I'm aware that 50 years is a lot of time to jump through halfway through a season, but I don't think it needs to kill the pacing in the way that it might for a different show. All our characters are Númenorians, and all Númenorians live for centuries, so we don't need to do anything radical with like recasting or aging up the actors in any particularly significant way. Hairstyles could change to reflect that time has passed, and the younger generation would have a more adult bearing to them than they did before, but 50 years would not affect Númenorians the same way it would affect other mortals. And if you're still unconvinced and you think, nope, 50 years is just too big of a time jump for a TV show to handle in the middle of a season, fair enough. I'm going to continue this video as if 50 years had passed because A, that's what Tolkien wrote, and B, because I made such a fuss about the time compression a few videos ago, I don't want to be branded a hypocrite. But I think if we all try to be intelligent for a moment, surely we can recognize that compressing a few decades into one story is fundamentally different from compressing 3.5 millennia into one story. So I actually wouldn't have too much of a problem if a writer decided to compress these 50 years into, say, 5 years. All that really matters is that some time has passed. Anyway, from the perspective of the faithful in Arndunie, the most significant thing to happen in these skipped over years is that Isildur and Eärien have had their first child. A son called Elendur, who Tolkien describes as one of the greatest and fairest of all the descendants of Elendil. He won't be a huge part of Season 4, although he probably would be the youngest adult man of the faithful, and in Season 5 I think he should be a relatively major character. Because if we follow Tolkien's timeline to the letter, Elendur would be 20 years old by the time we meet him after the time jump. Not far off the same age his uncle Anarion was back at the beginning of Season 3. And speaking of Anarion, I think we can begin the second half of Season 4 with a scene that serves as a sequel to the scene that began the first half of this season, another wedding among the faithful. But this time it's Anarion getting married, and this time they are in Arndunie. Anarion's wife is a character we know nothing about, except that along with Eärien, she will go on to be the joint first ever Queen of Gondor. And by marrying the second son of Elendil, she must surely become a pretty high-ranking member of the Faithful. So I think there's potential to invent another cool character here. Also, we are explicitly told by Tolkien that the firstborn child of Anarion, whose name will be Menelndil, is the very last person ever to be born on the island of Númenor. We've now arrived at the final act of Númenor's story. And just as Isildur and Eärion's wedding was a joyous affair nestled in the midst of conflict and strife, Anarion's wedding is nestled in the middle of a straight-up war. For 50 years, the King's Men have been besieging Arndunie, flying the banners of Pharazôn and Sauron from their standards. But if we look at a map and some of Tolkien's writings, we'll see that Arndunie is a really, really hard place to conquer, and it's a pretty easy place to defend. We can see that it is nestled between mountains, and Tolkien describes this part of the island as being made up of many rocky cliffs, but here the cliffs were in many places not at the sea's edge. So this is a land that is made up of sheer walls of rock, unscalable cliff faces that the King's Men cannot conquer and the faithful cannot leave. After 50 years of fighting, Númenor's civil war has turned into a stalemate. However, back east in Armenelos, there is one character who is more changed by the passing of the years than anyone else. Pharazôn. 50 years ago, he was not a young man, now he is a very not young man, and the arrow wound that he took from Soroniel never fully healed. I know it's been a long time since he was shot, but I think that by showing the pain that still torments him even decades later, we can pay homage to some of the things that Tolkien wrote without delving too deeply past the copyright line. We know that although the King's Men grew obsessed with escaping death, death did not depart from the land. Rather, it came sooner, and in many dreadful guises. Now, madness and sickness assailed them, and they cursed themselves in their agony. Every day of Pharazôn's life is suffering, yet it's the end of that suffering that he fears most. Every day, the shadow of death lengthens, drawing closer and closer, and every day this knowledge makes him more wrathful, more hateful, and more dangerous. And every day, Sauron's power grows. Apart from Elendur, Isildur's son, the most significant thing that is created during this time jump, the biggest change to the character of Númenor, is the building of the Temple of Melkor. This temple is, I think, pretty much 100% of the reason why Tolkien skipped forward 5 decades between Sauron's arrival and Númenor's downfall. It should take time to build a temple of this scale. The Temple of Melkor, which dominates the city of Armenelos, should be ludicrously huge, like almost unbelievably huge. Realism isn't really what this temple's about. Holy crap is what this temple's about. In the heart of the capital sits the center of Melkor worship. We probably don't have the rights to specifics, but Tolkien explicitly told us that the walls are 500 feet high, 50 feet thick, and 500 feet in diameter. And atop the giant wall sits an enormous silver dome that is swiftly turned black by the belching smoke. Inside, we see a black seat for the High Priest Sauron, and before it, a fiery altar to Melkor himself. Under the Dark Lord's instruction, prisoners are dragged inside to be murdered upon Melkor's altar, humans sacrificed by Sauron. The blood of the innocent flows down the steps of the temple. Their bodies are burned with dishonor in the raging furnace, and black smoke is spat up into the sky. Now it is the king's men who kneel before Sauron. It's so hardcore. And who are these victims of Númenor's ultimate corruption? Well, some will be unfortunate Númenorians who may or may not have had a tenuous connection to the Faithful. I think we can actually look to real-world history for inspiration here. Civilians living in constant fear, innocent people being murdered en masse by their tyrant rulers. This is a really harrowing part of the story. This should not be fun to watch, it shouldn't be easy to watch, but it's important. What happens in Númenor is unique. There are evil men in the First Age, and there will be evil men in the Third Age, but no one in all of Tolkien's writings ever turns to the dark side quite like this. This is unspeakable. It has to be. It's the only way to justify Tolkien's ending. But it's not just Númenorians who are human sacrificed by Sauron. Over in Middle-earth, the colonies have turned just as dark as the island. Tolkien tells us that the Númenorians sailed now with power and armory, and they came no longer as bringers of gifts, nor even as rulers, but as fierce men of war. And they hunted the men of Middle-earth, and took their goods and enslaved them, and many they slew cruelly upon their altars. Now, I'm not going to go into much detail here, this is already a really long video, but I imagine there is a real potential for a Season 4 subplot taking place in Middle-earth, and telling the tale of some of these men who the Black Númenorians are hunting. Men of Harad. In The Lord of the Rings, the story unfolds from the perspective of the Men of the West. They are the good guys, and the Haradrim are the invaders. They're the enemy, the servants of Sauron. However, in this story, the complete opposite is true. The Men of Harad are the ones we should be rooting for. They are the heroes of their story, and it is the Men of the West, the ancestors of the Men of Gondor, who are the villains. This is another good example of that major theme I mentioned in the last video, opposites exchanging places. It's a really recurrent part of the Númenor story, and I think it would be really cool to see from a Haradrim perspective why it is that the descendants of these men will hate the Men of the West so much in the future. Also, pretty much every storyline in Seasons 1, 2, 3, and 4 should fundamentally be about building up to Season 5, the War of the Last Alliance, the point of the entire Second Age. And I think we can establish some of that by focusing on a family in Harad, and demonstrating how the evil of the Númenorians has divided them, sibling against sibling. One side of the family should have the wisdom to perceive that the true enemy is in fact Sauron, and their descendants will eventually make peace with the survivors of Númenor and join Elendil in the alliance to overthrow the Dark Lord. However, the other half of this family have been so radicalized by their horrendous mistreatment at the hands of these Númenorians that they would rather join Sauron than make peace with the Dunedain. Their descendants will fight with Mordor against the Alliance. And while we're in Middle-earth, I think we should get at least a few scenes with our major elven characters of Seasons 1 and 2. The focus should stay in Númenor, but it would be a shame to neglect the elves entirely. And of course we know from Season 3 that Galadriel, Celeborn and Celebrian are currently hanging out in the south of Middle-earth, pretty close to the Númenorian colonies. Now, I know Galadriel is the most iconic of the elven characters, but I actually think the more interesting perspective to focus on here would be Celebrian's, her daughters. No longer is Celebrian a young elf, but she wouldn't yet have the almost primeval mindset of her super ancient parents. And from her potentially naive, deathless perspective, I think she would be a bit mind-blind as to how a fear of death could corrupt people to such a heinous extent. She just can't fathom it. Back in seasons 1 and 2, the Númenóreans were elf friends. They fought together against Sauron, but now they are doing Sauron's work and hating her people. From Celebrian's timeless perspective, nothing has changed. From the Númenórean perspective, everything has changed. But Celebrian just can't understand why. It's really sad. And just before I jump back to Númenor for the finale, I imagine any storyline involving Elrond, Gil-galad or Círdan in Season 4 should really just be laying the foundations for their pivotal roles in Season 5. We are going to spend a lot of time next season establishing their relationship with the exile Númenóreans, so for the sake of giving that story the time it needs, I think Season 4 should establish the rebuilding of their relationship with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. In Seasons 1 and 2, there was a great alliance between Celebrimbor of Eregion and King Durin III. And now, over 1,000 years later, both those guys are dead. But a new alliance is forming between Elrond of Rivendell and King Durin IV. So that's what I would suggest should be happening in the north of Middle-earth. Anyway, back to Númenor. But just before I continue with the story, I want to share a fun fact that I promise will become relevant in just a second. So, Tolkien, right? In real life, this is true. He had a recurring dream. And we know this because he wrote about his dream in numerous letters. Furthermore, and this is unbelievably fascinating, according to those letters written in Tolkien's hand, the same recurring dream was inherited by Tolkien's eldest son, Michael Tolkien, although it was many years before either of them learned that the other shared the same dreadful dream. Now, the subject matter of this recurrent nightmare, to be honest, is also unbelievably fascinating. In his own words, both John Ronald Rowell and Michael Tolkien had a dream, beginning with memory of the Great Wave, towering up and coming in ineluctably over the trees and green fields. In a different letter, Tolkien wrote that in sleep I had the dreadful dream of the ineluctable wave, either coming out of the quiet sea or coming in, towering over the green inlands. It always ends by surrender, and I awake gasping out of deep water. And Tolkien experienced this dream for years and years. He described it as a recurrent Atlantis dream, the stupendous and ineluctable wave advancing from the sea or over the land. But what is potentially most fascinating of all is that in 1955, Tolkien also wrote, "I don't think I have had this dream since I wrote the Downfall of Númenor as the last of the legends of the First and Second Age." Isn't that crazy? Tolkien dreamt of a great wave and he passed that dream on to his son somehow, but then, when he'd finished writing his own version of that dream, it departed. Also, this isn't just a fun fact from Tolkien's letters, it is also an important part of The Lord of the Rings. In writings that we absolutely do have the rights to, Tolkien bequeathed this dream of the Great Wave to Faramir. In Return of the King, Faramir, a dude in whom Tolkien tells us the blood of Númenor runs true, by the way, he and Éowyn are looking east out of Minas Tirith. And at the very moment the One Ring is destroyed, it seemed to them that above the ridges of the distant mountains, another vast mountain of darkness rose, towering up like a wave that should engulf the world. Faramir turns to Éowyn and he says, "It reminds me of Númenor, and the great dark wave climbing over the green lands and above the hills and coming on, darkness unescapable. I often dream of it." So, the point I'm making here is that this is a pretty profound part of Tolkien's legendarium and also just his psyche in general, and thanks to Faramir, we totally do have the right to use it. Which means I think this is a very important thing to intelligently explore in the show. And, in my opinion, the character who presents the best opportunity to do so is the daughter of water, Eärien. Now, Christopher Tolkien famously said that he didn't like it when Peter Jackson would give dialogue from one character to a different character in the movies, and, fair enough, I guess. But, to be honest, we don't need to use Faramir's exact language here, we just need to capture the sentiment. I think Eärien should have her own version of the Atlantis dream. She should see the great wave rising ineluctably over the island, she should awake gasping out of deep water, and she should interpret it correctly as a warning. I think Eärien should go to her father-in-law, Elendil, she should tell him what she's seen, and she should set in motion the role of the faithful in the finale. The island can no longer be saved. Númenor is beyond salvation. But that is not true of all Númenorians. And it's not true of Númenor's legacy. No longer is it the fate of the faithful to save the land of the gifts, but there are gifts of the land that can be saved, must be saved. For upon the doomed island is the inheritance left by Eärendil and Elros and the elf friends who fought with Gil-galad in Season 2, and the descendants of the Edain who fought against Morgoth in the First Age. So, Elendil takes Isildur and Anarion and a group of his most trusted and most competent faithful, and they make the incredibly dangerous journey back east, towards the capital, to try and save what can be saved of the gifts of Númenor. Which brings us back to Míriel, and that Palantir she gave to Elendil back at the beginning of Season 4. I imagine that Míriel would have been using her Palantir to secretly communicate with Elendil, and to pass on messages to the faithful. The Palantiri were originally made by elves of the West, probably Feanor actually, and given to the Númenorians as gifts. So it makes sense that the King's Men would shun the Seeing Stones of the Eldar, and by this late stage in Pharazôn's rule, they probably would be almost forgotten. Except to the daughter of the elf-friend king, a guy whose name was Palantir. So, Míriel should look into the secret Palantir that once belonged to her father, and she should use it to communicate with her old friend Elendil, without fearing too greatly that someone else might be watching. None of the King's Men ever would. Through the Seeing Stone, Míriel can give the faithful inside information, which allows them to stay one step ahead and avoid extinction. In fact, maybe Míriel could even be secretly involved in some super secret network that helps captured faithful and enemies of Pharazôn's escape to Arndunie and thus be free from the fires of Melkor's temple. However, in The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien sets a precedent for the Palantiri having a sinister quality about them. And 100% of the reason why the Palantiri are not totally great by the Third Age is because one of them falls into the hands of Sauron. Pharazôn may have no interest in ancient elvish technology, but Sauron does not suffer from that lack of far-sightedness. And if Sauron did sequester a Palantir from some hidden vault in the palace of Armenelos, he would be able to see what Elendil and Míriel see. Their communication would be secret no longer. Anyway, a storyline involving some faithful Númenóreans travelling to the capital undercover in the hopes of rescuing part of what made Númenor so great back in the day brings us to the first actually canonical thing that Isildur ever does in all of Tolkien's writings, and it brings us to what is surely one of the most Tolkienian themes of them all. Don't be a dick to trees. At this point in the story, Sauron's influence has grown so great, and Pharazôn's fear and wrath have grown so beyond the realms of reason that he finally gives Sauron permission to cut down Nimloth, the great white tree of Númenor that's been growing in the courtyard of the king since the very beginning. A descendant of a tree that was made in the image of Telperion, one of the original 2 trees that lit the undying lands of Valinor. In the first age, those trees were destroyed by Melkor, and in the second age, Nimloth is destroyed by Sauron, and burned to ash within the fires of Melkor's altar. But just before that happens, Isildur, cloaked and hooded, stole inside the very courtyard of the king. He snuck past the guards of Pharazôn and the servants of Sauron, and although Nimloth was seemingly bare and almost lifeless, a single fruit remained. And Isildur risked his life to take it, to save it. We are told in both the Silmarillion and the appendices that he was very nearly killed in the process. He was assailed and surrounded and received many wounds from Sauron's servants as he fought his way out. But due to the heroism of Isildur, a seed of Nimloth survived. And when that seed is planted and a shoot sprouts from it, this new sapling becomes a treasure of the faithful. This tiny little baby tree of Isildur's is destined to grow into the first white tree of Gondor. And this is pretty awesome. Throughout the rest of the entire history of the Dunedain, Sauron will keep on trying to destroy this tree over and over and over. But over and over and over, he fails to wipe it out entirely. Time after time, either Isildur or a member of his family will save some vestige of Nimloth. And because they do, it will grow again. Until, in just over 3,000 years' time, Isildur's heir, Aragorn, will find one more sapling of this white tree, and he will plant it before his coronation, and we will see that despite all the efforts of Sauron, by the end of the Third Age, he will be destroyed, and a scion of the white tree will blossom again. It'll take over 3,000 years, but in the end, Isildur is going to get the last laugh. His legacy is going to endure in a way that Sauron's is not. Anyway, that's pretty much all the specifics that Tolkien gives us regarding Isildur's rescue of Nimloth's last fruit, but for the sake of tying our storylines together, I think we can use Isildur's epic hero moment to also shine some light on a few of our other main characters. I really can't imagine how Isildur could break into the courtyard of the king without at least some help from someone in the palace, and Míriel is, I guess, the obvious character to be that someone. However, we do know from Tolkien that Isildur was assailed by Sauron's servants and very nearly killed in this process, which could tie into Sauron's spying via a palantir, like he knew the faithful were coming. And I have one last invented storyline to briefly talk about here, and honestly, the only reason I'm suggesting that the storyline should exist is because of an interesting tidbit that Tolkien tells us about, but doesn't really embellish upon. In the Lord of the Rings appendices, we are told that there is no one in the world who Sauron hates more than Elendil. Towards the end of Season 5, Elendil and Sauron are going to have a world-changingly significant confrontation, and I think we should set that up a little bit in Season 4. We should demonstrate that there is some kind of pre-existing relationship between Elendil and Sauron. Now, there are 100 ways that this could be done, but the one that I'll spitball, I guess, is that maybe, whilst Isildur is wounded, taking the fruit of Nimloth, Anarion, his brother, steps up and does what he must to rescue Isildur. Anarion flees with Isildur into the night, while Elendil stays to cover the escape of his sons. Perhaps many of his faithful are slain by the guards of Sauron and Pharazôn, but Elendil is taken alive. Which means our original trio from Season 3, Elendil, Míriel and Pharazôn, are now reunited. However, despite the childhood memories they once made together, Pharazôn now sentences Elendil to be sacrificed upon Melkor's altar, and there is nothing Míriel can do. This seems like it could be Pharazôn's moment of triumph over the faithful, but once again he underestimates the extent to which Míriel hates him, and the bravery that she is capable of. I think Míriel and Sauron represent two very interesting sides of one coin, and we'll see more of that at the end. But despite their astounding differences, they do share a few similarities. Most relevant in this moment is that although both are kind of reliant on Pharazôn, they do both have power over him, and they're both pretty independent of the other. Obviously, there is nothing Míriel can do at this point to stop Sauron's spiritual conquest of Númenor, but at the same time, there's nothing Sauron can really do to her. Míriel is the only person in, the whole world who can look Sauron in the eye, insult him to his face, and walk away without getting, human sacrificed. She is the queen of a kingdom that is doomed to utter catastrophe, and so as the days count down, she has less and less to lose, less and less to fear. And as Season 4 nears its finale, I think we can see Míriel push her luck more and more and prove to herself and her people and the audience that although she has been put in this horrendous situation for decades now, and so far her character has been all about contradictions, at the end of the day she has finally learned who she is. She is the daughter of an elf friend. She is a descendant of Aladarion and an heir of Elros. Beneath all the contradictions and complexities that define her character, Míriel is an enemy of the darkness. So, I imagine Elendil is in his cell, awaiting death in the morning and making peace with the fact that although he is about to die, his sons yet live. His grandson is in the care of Eärien, and the seed of Nimloth shall grow again. But then it is Míriel's turn to secretly visit a prisoner in the palace's dungeons. And through her dialogue with Elendil, we should see just how strong their bond truly is. Elendil is the direct descendant of Silmarien. Míriel is the direct descendant of Silmarien's brother. Elendil is the rightful owner of the Silver Sceptre, and Míriel is the rightful owner of the ruling sceptre. They are kin. They always have been kin. And although things are so much darker and so much more complicated than they were during the days of Silmarillane, both Míriel and Elendil share descent from Eärendil. They both acknowledge their loyalty to the faithful, and they both declare their opposition to Sauron and Pharazôn and all the evil things that those two have brought upon Númenor. So, in her final act as Pharazôn's wife, in her final act as Azimrafel, Lady of the Kingsmen, Tar Míriel breaks Elendil from his cell, and together they both flee from the capital for the final time. Now, as I say, that is made up. Tolkien doesn't give us any details on these two at this point in the story, but if we accept that Míriel and Elendil flee to Rómenna, where they reunite with Anarion and Isildur in their old home in Rómenna, with the fruit of Nimloth and the last of the Faithful's warriors, we now have nothing left to invent. From this moment on, we are just following Tolkien's lead to the ultimate season finale. Back in Armenelos, Pharazôn and Sauron burn the white tree in the fires of Melkor's temple, and Númenor descends to its lowest low. More and more prisoners are murdered upon the altar, but no matter what Pharazôn does, there is no release from death. In fact, quite the opposite. Death comes sooner now. Númenorian lifespans have diminished. For the first time ever, sickness descends upon Númenor. Madness infects the minds of its people. Violence spreads like cancer. Hatred and anger and fear consume the island. Sauron walks the lands as a god-king, setting man against man, until the Númenorians begin to devour themselves. In Tolkien's own words, Pharazôn becomes the mightiest tyrant that had yet been in the world since the reign of Morgoth, though in truth, Sauron ruled all from behind the throne. But still, the shadow of death creeps closer and closer, until, in his desperation, Pharazôn turns to Sauron for one last piece of advice. And this is the moment in which I think Sauron should utter the only line of dialogue to appear in both the Lord of the Rings appendices and the Silmarillion. Sauron says to Pharazôn, "Great kings take. What is their right?" Whilst besotted with the lies of Sauron, Pharazôn makes the worst decision that any mortal has ever made in the history of Arda. He decides that he will take immortality through conquest. He will break the ban of the Valar. He will sail west, and he will make war upon the deathless. This is why I said it was so important to establish the Eärendil story earlier on in Season 3. This is the other side of that coin. At the end of the First Age, Eärendil sailed west and he saved the world. At the end of the Second Age, his distant yet direct descendant Pharazôn will also sail west, but in so doing, his actions will break the world. Under Sauron's instruction, Pharazôn orders the construction of a great armament, the largest and mightiest fleet ever assembled throughout all time. And with it, he intends to defy every law of nature that exists. He intends to seize deathlessness by force and to rid himself of the gift of men. And we should see just how awful this rebellion against nature really is. During the construction of the Great Armament, Tolkien tells us that the days grew dark, the skies turned black. Days that once were warm are now blisteringly hot. Nights that were cool are ruthlessly cold. Rain has turned to hail. Winds have turned to storms, and far off on the western horizon there flies a vast force of great eagles. But these agents of the Valar are no longer friends to Númenor. They are arrayed as for war, and beneath their wings shoots lightning and the echo of thunder. Earthquakes topple buildings, smoke rises from the peak of the great mountain Meneltarma, which until now we did not know was a volcano. Lightning strikes people dead in the streets, and the waves roar against the coast. This is the end times. And yet Pharazôn does not stop. Every natural disaster hardens his heart further and further. It reinforces his hatred of the Valar and his reliance upon Sauron. Until, eventually, we reach the final episode of Season 4. The Great Armament is finally complete. Finally, Pharazôn is ready to launch the mightiest fleet that will ever set sail, and to begin his conquest of the Undying Lands. From the dome of Melkor's temple, Sauron watches the fleet depart, but he does not go with them. Instead, Númenor is emptied, and Sauron laughs. He's just won. He's finally taken revenge on the Númenorians who stole his victory back in Season 2. Now, obviously, the faithful do not join this armament either. As the king's men moved west to build their great fleet, Soroniel and Eärien lead the last of the faithful east. They return once again to the port city of Rómenna, and once again opposites have exchanged places. While Pharazôn sails west towards war, Elendil looks east in hope. And he builds 9 ships of his own. There is a reason that during the Lord of the Rings, in Gondor and especially in Minas Tirith, there is so much knowledge and lore that by then exists nowhere else in Middle-earth. The reason Minas Tirith has such a wealth of knowledge in the Third Age is because in the final days of Númenor's existence, Anarion entered the deserted libraries of Armenelos. He scoured the vaults of the king's palace, and he rescued the knowledge that will one day be inherited by future generations of the Dunedain. He ensures that some vestige of Númenor will survive in Middle-earth. And among these artifacts, Anarion gifts to his father 6 more Palantiri. Anyway, this is the final episode. This is what every thread of the Númenor storyline has been building to. Darkness falls upon the land. The sea is still. The entire world waits for Pharazôn to make his final move. He sails west, beyond the sight of Númenor. He breaks the ban of the Valar and sails into forbidden seas. And then he sees it. Soundless shores. The great mountain Taniquetil in the uttermost west, shining whiter than snow, colder than death, silent, immutable, terrible as the shadow of the light of Ilúvatar. But there is no wind to carry his armament towards it. No force of nature would ever aid him in this absolute rebellion. So, Pharazôn's fleet is powered by slaves, pulling on oars beneath the lash of their masters' whips. And as Valinor draws near, Pharazôn has a moment of doubt. He looks upon the western lands, and his heart wavers. For a moment he does not know if he can go on, but all of the pride, and all of the ambition, and all the power, and all the glory of Pharazôn, all of it is utterly eclipsed by that fear of death. So he does the unthinkable. He strides onto the shores of Valinor. He declares all the undying lands for himself. His army marches through the blessed realm, and they meet no opposition. The lords of the Valar watch them approach, yet they do not fight back. This insult to the natural order is beyond any of them. Even the gods of Arda will not dare stand between Pharazôn and what he deserves. Instead, they call upon the One, the power that even they would bow to, he who exists outside of creation, Ilúvatar. And so Ilúvatar intervenes. He shows forth his power, and he changes the shape of the world. A great chasm he opens in the sea, and all the fleets of the Númenóreans are dragged down into the abyss. Pharazôn and his warriors who came ashore are swallowed by falling mountains, and there they lie imprisoned forever in the caves of the Forgotten. Pharazôn, the guy who rejected the gift of Ilúvatar. The guy who brought ruin to his people, now trapped forever in the caves of the Forgotten. His spirit abandoned by Ilúvatar, never to leave Arda, never to be free until the last battle and the day of doom. That is what you get, Pharazôn. Worst mortal ever. But that is not quite the end of the story. Following Pharazôn's failed conquest, the Undying Lands are removed from the circles of the world, so that none may ever again sail west without the permission of the Valar. Anyway, back in Númenor, the faithful begin to feel the doom that is approaching. Fire erupts from Meneltarma. A great wind sweeps over the island. Great waves crash upon the shores, and hills begin to crumble into ruin. Now, back at the beginning of my last video, I briefly mentioned Elendil's father, a guy called Armandil, who I've not included in this adaptation as he's never mentioned in The Lord of the Rings, but I have tried to include some of the themes that his character represents. However, the main thing that Armandil does during the downfall of Númenor is sail west alone in advance of Pharazôn in the hopes of maybe reaching the Undying Lands and begging the Valar to show mercy for the treason of Númenor. Now, Tolkien never tells us what happens to him. It's one of those great mysteries of the Legendarium, and I certainly don't think we should have a different character sail west in his place. That's far too great of a departure from the source material. But I do think this part of the story can still be explored, just in a slightly different way. As Númenor crumbles all around the faithful, Elendil and his people hurry aboard those 9 ships, and they prepare to raise anchor, to abandon their homeland as it is reclaimed by the waves. However, Míriel should not go with them. She is the rightful queen of Númenor. She has never left Númenor, and she never will. If Númenor must die, then she must die with it. The king's sceptre is buried with Pharazôn, and the silver sceptre belongs to Elendil. So long as Míriel lives, he cannot be the High King of the Dúnedain. Almost 3,000 years ago, the royal line of Elros was split. into the descendants of Silmarien and the descendants of her brother. And now we realize why that matters. Silmarien's brother was destined to be the forefather of all Númenor's High Kings, but only so long as Númenor existed. Silmarien, however, her line, the wielders of the Silver Sceptre, they were destined to survive, to be the High Kings of the Númenorians in exile. And I believe right at the end of her story, Míriel realizes this too. I think she should bid farewell to Elendil and entrust the last of her father's elf friends to his care. Then she should go alone to Meneltarma, to the Holy Mountain, and as her island falls to ruin all around her, she kneels and she utters a prayer to Ilúvatar. She does not ask to be spared from his doom. She knows that Númenor's last queen must die with her country. She accepts that. She asks only that the faithful be spared. And what I think is really cool about this is that in a very roundabout way, the death of Míriel, last ruler of Númenor, kind of echoes the death of Elros, first ruler. Obviously, this is very, very different, and yet no, it's not. In the very end, Míriel embraces the gift of death. She relinquishes her life willingly to Ilúvatar, just as Elros did right at the beginning. As Míriel finishes her prayer, and Armenelos is utterly destroyed, she simply exhales her final breath and dies in peace. She is not killed. Ilúvatar simply takes her spirit into his care, and she is spared the pain of dying. The apocalyptic wave thunders towards her, it sweeps her away, but she is not slain by it. Such is the gift of Ilúvatar. Anyway, whilst all of this is happening, I think we can intercut Míriel's final scene with Sauron's. While Míriel kneels and humbles herself before Ilúvatar, Sauron sits upon his black throne in Melkor's temple, and he revels in his ultimate win. Except, actually, no. This is not the win that Sauron was anticipating. His plan was to destroy the Númenorians, but not the island of Númenor. He's still on the island of Númenor. Drowning the island of Númenor while he's still on it is a massive inconvenience. In the final moments of Númenor's existence, Sauron should realize that actually he's taken this too far. There is now no escape. And as his temple is unroofed and thrown down, he realizes the extent to which he has screwed up. In the absolute antithesis of Míriel's peaceful death, Sauron's body is utterly ripped apart by the fury of Ilúvatar, and although we know he's not, dead, he is defeated. Never again will Sauron be able to take a fair form. Never again will he be able to deceive. And as Númenor is destroyed, so too is a great part of Sauron's power. But you may very well be wondering, if Sauron's body is destroyed in Númenor and he's wearing the One Ring, how can his incorporeal spirit carry the One Ring back to Mordor? This is a good question, and Tolkien actually foresaw it being asked. In letter 211, Tolkien wrote, "Though reduced to a spirit of hatred, born on a dark wind, I do not think one need boggle at the spirit carrying off the One Ring upon which his power of dominating minds now largely depended." So there you go, in the words of Tolkien, don't overthink it. Sauron's spirit somehow carried the ring back to Middle-earth on a dark wind, and that is the last time we will see him until Season 5. Anyway, just before I finish this video, I want to read, in Tolkien's words, how the Downfall of Númenor is written. And it doesn't matter if we have the rights to this awe-inspiring piece of language or not, it's the feeling that matters. Whatever you feel hearing these words, that's the feeling that any adaptation needs to be trying to capture. If you don't get goosebumps from hearing this, it's because I'm not reading it right. This is one of the most profound paragraphs that Tolkien ever wrote. Then suddenly, fire burst from the Meneltarma, and there came a mighty wind and a tumult of the earth, and the sky reeled, and the hills slid, and Númenor went down into the sea, with all its children, and its wives, and its maidens, and its ladies proud, and all its gardens, and its halls, and its towers, its tombs, and its riches, and its jewels, and its webs, and its things painted and carven, and its laughter, and its mirth, and its music, its wisdom, and its lore, they vanished forever. And, last of all, the mounting wave, green and cold and plumed with foam, climbing over the land, took to its bosom Míriel, the queen, fairer than silver or ivory or pearls. And thus dies the nation of Númenor. As the island is drowned, we should see the 9 ships of Elendil floundering in this biblical, apocalyptic storm. Waves as tall as buildings carry the ships away. Winds stronger than anything that's possible sweep them asunder. And we see that the faithful are not sailing away from Númenor. They have no control here. Instead, this is the work of that power greater than even the Valar. The water. The waves themselves, the power that is ever present yet never seen, separates the ships of Elendil, and all 9 are lost amid the fury of the water, and then we fade to black. Which brings us to the final scene of Season 4. And it should begin, I think, with music. Gentle music, something beautiful. Something very different from what we've just seen. And the first thing that we see on screen is a ring of power. The ring of water, on a chain around the neck of Galadriel. Then we see another ring, the ring of fire, this time around the neck of Círdan the shipwright. 2 scenes showing effectively the same thing, but in 2 different parts of the world. Círdan on the northwest coast, Galadriel on the southwest. Without any dialogue whatsoever, Galadriel and Celeborn and Celebrian wander towards the shore, and there they find that the coastline of Middle-earth is completely changed. The drowning of Númenor has affected everything. In the northwest, Círdan and his High King Gil-galad also approach the shore, and they too marvel at the magnitude of what has happened. And as these mighty elven legends of seasons 1 and 2 look out at their respective waterfronts, they see ships wrecked in the shallows. In the north there are 4, in the south there are 5. And as Gil-galad and Círdan approach one of the northern ships, we hear the gentle music fade out, and a man's voice begins to sing. Ideally, a lot more beautifully than this. Et earelo endurena utulien, sino me maruvan ahildiniar. tenambar meta. These words are Quenya, and as you know, they were included in Peter Jackson's movies during the coronation of Aragorn. Also, we hear them when we first see the Argonath. But these words were not written for those movies. They are found in that same chapter of The Lord of the Rings where Faramir tells Eowyn about his Númenor dream. And in that chapter we are told two things. First, we are told what the words mean, and second, we are told who it was who first spoke them. Etearelo endordena utulien sinome maruva nahildinia tenamba matar. What that means is, out of the great sea to Middle Earth I am come. In this place I will abide, and my heirs unto the ending of the world. Those were the words that Elendil spoke when he first came up out of the sea on the wings of the wind. In the south, Galadriel should approach the shipwreck and find that among the men lying on the shore are Isildur and Anarion, and they're alive. At the same moment in the north, Elendil should open his eyes and find that standing over him is Gil-galad. Finally, the elves of seasons 1 and 2 and the men of seasons 3 and 4 have united. The moment High King Elendil looks upon High King Gil-galad marks the first moment of the last alliance. And that is the point of Season 5. So, there you go. There's my thoughts on how Season 4 of this hypothetical Tolkien-esque Rings of Power show could have been written. I hope it's obvious that I'm not saying this is the only way it could have been written, and I'm also not claiming that every second of what I talked about there goes exactly the way Tolkien wrote it. That's simply not possible for any adaptation of the Second Age. But through all the inventions and very minor tweaks that I've made to the source material, I've tried to ensure that the core of the original is unchanged from what Tolkien intended. And if you enjoyed this video, I'm very glad. And if you enjoyed it more than Amazon's actual Rings of Power so far, then take that as a testament to how profoundly rich Tolkien's writings can be. How amazingly cool this show could have been if the showrunners had any intention of actually adapting the source material, instead of just kinda monetizing it. Anyway, I'm not going to go on a rant right now. If you did enjoy this video, make sure to check back soon for the final part of this series where I will break down my ideas for Season 5, a Rings of Power finale, the closing part of the Second Age trilogy. So, to make sure you don't miss that, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and click like and share this video with your friends if you want to. However, as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Navaya Melanine.